Alright, welcome to Blender Fast Track Volume 1, Part 2. We're working towards creating this exact frame you see right here, and in Part 2 we'll go through the process of building out the sword asset. If you would like to get to know me and my experience working in the CG industry, you'll find a link to my demo reel in the description below. In Part 2 we have 4 areas to cover. Part 1, we're going to get into hotkeys. Part 2, we're going to get into the basics of polygon modeling. Step 3, we'll start to build out the shaders for our asset. Step 4, we'll be diving into Blender's texture painting tool and start to detail out our sword. This is the part where Blender Fast Track really starts to be a challenge. This is designed for those who are really serious about taking their 3D skills to the next level. Some tips moving forward. Practice Part 1. Try to take the Minecraft scene from being this really small scene to this really giant scene. Tip number 2, use the screenshots. These screenshots are going to be the tool that helps accelerate the learning curve. In each one you will find a step-by-step, button-for-button walkthrough on how to recreate each chapter. Now, are you ready for Blender Fast Track Part 2? Let's get going. So let's take a look at some hotkeys that we want to implement. So hotkeys are essentially one of the best ways to get out of that beginner phase and quickly get into more of an intermediate level with 3D. As we go, don't forget we can always see the hotkeys that I'm using right here in the top right hand corner, and there'll be a link to a hotkey cheat sheet down in the description below. So the only hotkeys that we've been using up to this point are the navigation tools. The second level of hotkeys that we want to implement is our viewport tools. Move, rotate, scale, select. So if I select this guy, I'm going to go through these hotkeys one by one. So if I select this cube and hit G, we can move just like that. So we have G, we have R for rotate, and then we have S for scale. So G, why is it called G? I have no idea why Blender made their move tool G. A quick way that I like to remember that by is just give it a little push. So G for give it a push. If they would have made the hotkey M for move, it would have been a pretty awkward spot for your hand. It's on the other side of the keyboard. So it's a good thing that they made it the center of the keyboard. If you notice the hotkeys with Blender, when we hit G like this, it's pretty awkward. Like when we move, typically we just want to use our move transform right here, our move gizmo, and move it like this in a very incremental way, in a very precise way. But when we use the hotkey, we get this. I'm going to show you guys a quick way to kind of convert the hotkey over to just be this gizmo tool, but I just want to show you guys kind of like the standard way with Blender, which is kind of clunky and really difficult. Then I'll show you guys a more like industry standard way to do this, which will make Blender act more like Maya, Houdini, Substance Painter, all of those kind of packages. So when you move stuff by hitting G like this, what Blender wants you to do is use the hotkeys X, Y, and Z to snap it to an axis, which one is just difficult to remember. Two, it's an extra step. So we essentially have to hit G, hit X, and then click it down to actually move it, which can be a pain, and the whole point of hotkeys is to dramatically speed up our workflow. So I'm going to show you guys how to remap these hotkeys to work with these gizmos over here. So first off, if we hover over this, we notice that we already have a hotkey. Shift, spacebar, and then G. So basically what Blender wants you to do is do Shift, spacebar, and then hit G, which again is just another step. We just want to use the tools over here. As we hover over these, it'll tell us Shift, Spacebar, and G. So what we want to do is actually click on this and then do a sign shortcut, just like this. And then before you click down on the mouse, before you do anything, just hover over this and hit G, just like that. And now you'll notice that when I hit G, the hotkey is now our viewport tools over here, which is what we want. It's going to allow us to work a lot faster. So I'm going to do the same thing with rotation. So if I hover over this, you'll notice it says Shift Spacebar R. I'm going to do right click, assign shortcut, and again, hover over it and press R. And then we'll do the same thing for our scale tool. So we'll right click, do assign shortcut. We'll hover over that and hit S. And then we want to do the same thing for our selection box. So W is the standard hotkey. It technically rotates through them, which is not really what we want. Most of the time, we're just going to be using the selection box anyway. So what we'll do is we'll click and hold right here, go to selection box, use that, and then we'll right click on this and do assign shortcut. So before we actually set this, I want to show you guys something that's very, very easy to do and very tricky. So be careful whenever you're setting these hotkeys. If you right click here and do assign shortcut, and then you accidentally actually click here with your mouse, what happens is the left mouse now becomes a shortcut for the selection tool, which is really wonky and you don't want that at all. So essentially anytime we select here and then we select somewhere here, it'll essentially switch back to the selection tool, which is not at all what we want. So what I'm going to do here to kind of get out of that is a failsafe. Right click here, go to remove shortcut. This will remove our custom shortcut. And then what we'll do is right click, assign shortcut like this. And then remember, don't click with your mouse. And we'll just hover over this and press W just like that. Great, so now we have W, G, S, and R to rotate between our viewport tools. So if you end up messing up any of these hotkeys and you're like, oh, I don't know how to fix it, you can always do File, Defaults, Load Factory Settings. But be careful, as soon as you do that, it'll reset all of our hotkeys. So that's a bit of a failsafe. If you want to clear out those modifications and start all over, you can do that. We have one more hotkey that we want to add to this list, and that's going to be frame selected. So if we go up to view and we do frame selected just like that, you'll notice that the viewport snaps to our cube, which can be really, really great for moving around our scene. The hotkey to do that is number pad dot, just like that. The problem with that hotkey is that you actually have to take your hand off the mouse to move it. And we want to be able to use that hotkey, the hotkey for frame selected, all the time. And if we're constantly moving our hand off of our mouse, that means our hand on our keyboard isn't actually doing hotkeys. And we want our left hand to drive the keyboard and our right hand to drive the mouse. So what we want to do is come up here to view. We'll do the same thing. Right click here and we'll do change shortcut. We'll hover over it. Then a shortcut that I like to use for this is just Shift F. So that's not going to overwrite any Blender hotkeys. And Shift F for frame selected. And now we get just like that. Cool. So we've modified all these, but before we move on, what we want to do is we want to adjust the edit modes hotkeys as well. So we can get to edit mode up here. So object mode, edit mode. What are these things? We're going to talk about object mode versus edit mode extensively in the next lesson. But before we get there, we want to just prep ourselves so we're ready with our hotkeys and we don't have to worry about them anymore. So we'll do the same thing here. I'll right click here, go to assign shortcut. Again, don't click anything, just hover over it and hit W. And then we'll do the same thing. Right click, change shortcut, hover over and hit G, right click, change shortcut, hover over and hit R, right click, change shortcut, hover over and hit S. The frame selected is still good to go, so that carries over. Cool, so next steps, what you want to do is you want to take all of these hotkeys and practice a little bit. Do some layouts, some scales, some rotations. So the more times you practice, the quicker you're going to level up your skills. Cool. So in the next chapter, what we'll do is we'll start taking a look at the polygon modeling tools in Blender. Cool. So in this chapter, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the object mode and the edit mode. And to kind of warm up for modeling the sword, we're going to take a small step and we're going to build this gear object right here. So before we start, I just want to introduce you guys to the modeling tab. We're not going to use that. We're going to stay in the layout mode. That's just to kind of make the learning curve a little bit easier. You do have a modeling tab right here. These two tabs are basically the same. The only real difference is that it's currently in edit mode, which I'll talk about in a bit, and that we don't actually have this little area down here. But for the sake of the tutorial, I'm just going to stay in layout mode, and that'll just make it a little bit more intuitive for us to use. Cool. So we can go from object mode to edit mode over here. So object mode is the standard. That's what we're on by default. If we switch over to edit mode, you'll see that all of a sudden everything becomes highlighted. And all of a sudden we see these little points right there. And all of a sudden we get all these buttons right there and this top menu changes. What are we looking at? So object mode is essentially where you can move your object around, right? Edit mode is where we start to move our individual points and edges and faces of the object around. So in object mode, we're moving the object. Edit mode, we're modifying the object. We're editing it. Cool. So a hotkey that we want to get used to is tab. And tab is going to essentially switch from object mode to edit mode, just like that. So to break down the differences, you'll notice that this top menu right here changes. So when we're in edit mode, we have access to a couple different things. First off is going to be our vertex, our edges, and our face selection. So right now we're currently on edge mode. And while I have my selection tool, I can select like this. And you notice when it's brown like this, that means everything's selected. And I can just select points like this and I can start moving them. So I'll use my hotkey G. We can move things around just like that, just like that. So object mode, you're moving the object. Edit mode, you're moving the points and that kind of stuff in the object. We also have edges up here. So if I select those like this, you can see I'm now selecting edges. This one, we're now selecting the individual faces. So vertex, edges, faces, that's essentially what makes up any polygon model. If we want to rotate between those selection, we want to use the hotkeys 1, 2, and 3. So 1 for selecting vertices, 2 for selecting edges, 3 for selecting faces. We also have our mesh, vertex, edge, face, UV. We'll get into a little bit of that as we go. So another big change that we have here with the edit mode is this polygon modeling toolkit right here. So the main ones that we're going to use are going to be extrude and loop cut. We're going to be using those a lot. So what extrude does is if we click on any one of our faces with 3 selected, so I'll hit 3 to go in our face mode, select a face, and I'll just hit extrude. And I'll just hit that and then go up like that. And you can see what it does in extrusion. So that operation is called an extrusion. The other one that we're going to be using is loop cut, otherwise known as an edge loop. So I'll click loop cut, and then you can see as we hover over this object. So if you notice, if you go over the edges like this, it'll start to display a loop cut, which is basically we're going to insert an edge into this object. So if I click here like that, we'll insert a loop just like that. If I click another one like that, I can also click on this and drag like that to precisely put it somewhere in between there. So next up, let's start building out the gear. If we want to get rid of this cube, we're currently in edit mode, right? So we don't want to actually delete anything here. What we want to do is go back up to object mode, just like that. And then we'll just delete just like that. And what I'll do is go up to add, we'll go up to mesh, we'll go to cylinder, just like that. And you'll notice in the bottom left-hand corner, before you click anything like this, we'll have this access to this little tab right here. And this is going to be some quick parameters of this primitive shape. So basically what that means is a default object will come with some parameters that we can adjust. What I'm going to do here is go to my vertices and switch this down to 12. And what that's going to do is just change how many rows that we see here. So you can see as I tweak this up and down, we're just tweaking that. And I'm controlling that by just clicking and dragging. So I'll just leave that on 12, just like that. I'm going to collapse like that. And then what I'm going to do is go into my edit mode, just like this. And you'll notice again, everything's highlighted. That's because everything's selected. Another hotkey that we want to get to know is going to be A. So if we double tap A, we'll deselect all. If we tap A, we'll select all. So we can just double tap A to get out of that. And what I'll do is I'll go into my selection tool. I'll go into my face selector right there. By using the hotkey 3, I'll select this and I'll hit delete. And then I'll go to faces just like that. And I'll do another one, select that, hit delete, faces. Now if we want to shrink this down, what we can do is go into, we can select all just like that, go into our scale tool and scale it down just like that. And now what we can do is just extrude it out. But you'll notice something weird. If we run this extrusion just like that, it's just going to go in one direction. So we're going to want to undo out of that, just like that. And what we want to do is go over here and click and hold and do extrude along normals. So what is a normal? What is extrude along normals? A normal is the direction the polygon is facing. So if we click and drag right here, just like this, you notice that it no longer goes in one direction, but it goes in all the directions because it's going along the polygon's normal. So just click and drag out just like that. And then what I'll do here is I'll grab my selection tool and I'll just start selecting like this. I'll do shift select all the way around like that. So we're selecting every other one. And then what we'll do is we'll do another extrude along normals. We'll click and drag like that. Cool, so that was a basic look at object mode and edge mode. And remember, the main difference between object and edit is object, you're moving the object. Edit, you're modifying that object. So if you ever run into a switch situation like this where you select stuff and you move it just like that, and all of a sudden you get this weird warpy looking thing, that's because you're actually selecting only half the points and you're not actually selecting the object. So what you need to do, switch over to edit mode and you can start moving stuff around like that. And then you can switch back to edit mode when you want to start modifying the object itself. Cool, so the polygon modeling tools are essentially is a destructive way to work, which means if we wanted to modify this, essentially we'd either have to start hacking stuff away or we'd have to redo it. But what we can do is we can start implementing the modifier stack. And the modifier stack is essentially a way to work non-destructively with polygon modeling inside of Blender. And we'll take a look at that in the next chapter. So in this chapter, what we'll do is we'll start taking a look at the modifier stack, which is essentially a way to perform modeling tasks in a very non-destructive way. It's one of my favorite areas of Blender comparing it to other packages like Maya. So modifiers. If we come over to this little gear icon, we can click modifiers just like that. And just to test out what a modifier does, we're going to essentially be working with two main modifiers. The first one, bevel, and the second one, subdivision. We'll talk about those as we go. The first one that we're going to do is subdivision surface. So before I get into talking about what a subdivision surface is, I'm just going to talk about what the modifiers are doing and what we're looking at in the viewport right here. So if you navigate around right here, you'll notice that we kind of have this cage, and then we have kind of like what looks like our old piece of geometry that's been smooth. So this cage, that's our actual geometry that we're working with. And this smooth mesh that's inside of here is that original mesh going through this subdivision modifier and then showing us the result of that. If you notice, if we go back and forth between edit mode and object mode, if we're in object mode, that little cage wireframe thing goes away because this is our actual final result. If we go back to edit mode, you'll see that we can see our original mesh and the subdivided mesh as well. So what is the subdivision modifier? The subdivision modifier is essentially going to add more polygons and smooth it at the same time, which is a really common operation with polygon modeling. Essentially, you model with like the low-res cage and then you smooth it afterwards. So instead of working with a really dense mesh, you work with a low-res mesh and then you smooth it later. Some things that we want to be using in here is the viewport. So the subdivisions right here, I'm just going to change the viewport over to 2. You'll notice that we have like render, viewport. What do these both mean? Viewport is what we're going to see in the viewport, and the subdivisions for render is what we're going to see at render time. Cool. So something else that you see here is that we see all these like polygon shapes here, which isn't exactly what we want. If we want this thing to look smooth, we want to get rid of those. So how do we do that? What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into object mode and go down to object and then shade smooth right there. And that'll just basically make the entire object look as if it doesn't have those little polygons. Cool. So modifiers, non-destructive. What does non-destructive means? It means that we can basically at any time take this operation off. So if we come over here, as I turn this little monitor icon off, you can see that's going to be just completely disabling it completely. So we have a disable for our visibility of our viewport. We can turn it off for our render. If we're in edit mode, and we can see it right here, we can actually turn it off for edit mode. So that kind of makes it a little bit easier when you're working between edit mode and object mode. You can actually just tab back and forth. And while you're in edit mode, you actually see your original mesh, which can be a little bit easier to work with. Seeing the cage and the final result at the same time can be beneficial for some scenarios, but it can be difficult in others. And next up, we have the move up and down tools, and the X will be to get rid of it completely. So if I get rid of it completely, you notice it's just gone. If I tab back and forth, it's non-destructive, meaning I can get rid of it anytime. I'm going to undo out of that, and then I'm just going to make it visible. Now I'm going to show you guys the bevel modifier, which is the other one that we'll be using extensively. So I'm going to add modifier, bevel. So we can't really see what's going on right here. So what I'm going to do here is just go up to our subdivision and turn it off like that. So we turn off viewport display. And essentially, if I turn off viewport display on this one, you can see what the bevel is doing is it's rounding the corners. So subdivision is going to be smoothing the entire object, but bevel will just smooth the actual corner. So it's super important to know the difference between those. If we want to bevel it first, so if you notice if I come here, the smooth and the bevel are not really working well together. So what we want to actually do is move this subdivision down just like that. So these little up and down arrow keys, we can actually move these things up and down. So the modifier works as a layer system. So it's super important to realize what's going on. So it works top down. So whatever the top modifier is going to be the first operation. And whatever the second modifier is going to be the second operation. So as you notice, as I move the subdivision up and down, you can see the subdivision is still smoothing our object, but it's doing so on top of the bevel, which is rounding those quarters. But actually, the bevel's actually giving us more geometry, so it actually hardened those edges before the subdivision operation has a chance to go on it. Cool. So what I'm going to do up here is tweak the bevel modifier a little bit. As you notice, it can kind of be hard to see what's happening here. If we adjust something like the segments, we can kind of see it, we can kind of not. Let's take a look at the viewport display tools to help us with that. So up here we have viewport shaded, which is what we're currently on. We have wireframe, which is going to show us the wireframe of the object. And those two are the main ones that we want to see. If we want to see the shading mode and the wireframe at the same time, what we can do is come to this little pull down option and then just check on display wireframe just like that. For now, I'm just going to go over to display a wireframe. And if I come in here to my segments, we can kind of start to see what we're doing a little bit better. And if we go over to object mode by hitting tab, you can notice that we can see a little bit better as well. And what I can do is click on the segments right here and hit 2, which will just add some more geometry resolution on those edges. And then the width, what we'll do is we'll set this to something like 0.01. And then what that'll do is kind of crease those edges a little bit more. Cool. So we'll switch back to our shaded mode. If we want the hotkey to be able to switch between these two modes very easily, the hotkey is Z. And then what we do right here with this little menu is just click right here on wireframe, go back to solid. So get to know that hotkey as well. Cool. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn back on our subdivision. I'm going to do Shift F to frame it. And there we go. That's our gear. Cool. So now in terms of the new edit mode, object mode, we know how to use all the tools. So from here on out, it's going to be more about technique. And what we want to do with this little gear is we want to start practicing our hotkeys. So what you want to do before we move on to the next chapter, where we're going to start to very rapidly start to increase the level of our skills, what we want to do is model this gear out 5 to 10 times. And we want to do it without using any of the interface tools. We want to use all these hotkeys that we see right here. So we use these hotkeys over here instead of using the viewport tools right here. Instead of using the toggle right here between object mode and edit mode. So we use the hotkeys 1, 2, and 3 to switch between our selection tools. And then we'll use our radial menu right there with Z to toggle back and forth between wireframe and solid. And essentially you want to think of this as like going to the gym. At first it's super difficult, but after a while it becomes very, very easy. So that's what we're doing here. At first, these hotkeys are very foreign, they're very difficult, they're hard to memorize, but what you want to do is just practice them over and over and over and over and over. And eventually they'll become second nature, and you won't have to think about them anymore. Cool, so after you practice that, in the next chapter, what we'll do is we'll start modeling out the sword asset. All right, so don't forget, when you're ready to follow along, in the description below, what you'll find is these screenshots. Just go ahead and click any one of them, and then you'll get presented with a step-for-step, button for button, hotkey for hotkey, the exact process of what you need to recreate each chapter. All right, so in this chapter, what we'll do is we'll start taking a look at how to model out the sword. We're going to start with the blade and we'll work from there. So this chapter will be probably the toughest chapter of this entire series, just because we're starting to incorporate a lot of the different tools that we need. And to get good at them just takes practice. So if you feel like you're struggling, take a step back and model out the gear a couple more times. And just know that if you make it through this chapter, each chapter after that will get better and better at this, and we'll start to level up our skills. So before moving on, what I'll do is I'm just going to start with the new scene. So I'll go to File, New, General. And before we get going, what we want to do is we want to save out our file. So this is something you want to kind of get in the practice of. So I'm just going to File, we'll do Save As. I'm going to do my sword, and then I'm just going to put a version 001 on it. So underscore V001. So I'm doing a version here because as we go, each step, what we can do is we can just set the version 2, version 3. And if we ever mess up, what we can do is we can always have a file to go back to instead of having to restart the whole file over. So I'll just do Save As Blender File. And as we go, just get in the habit of doing Control S or Command S to constantly save your work. It's very easy for any 3D app just to crash at any time and then you lose hours of work. So constantly hit Control S or Command S. Cool, so using our hotkeys, what I'm going to do is jump into W and do our selection tool, and I'll jump into S with our scale tool, just like this. So I'll start scaling this up just like that. And if you want to follow along with me exactly, the scale settings I want to have here are going to be 2.6, 44.3, and 0.065, just like that. We'll talk about scene scale more as we go. This scene scale right now that we're working in is not a very accurate workflow. And a practice that I like to do is when I'm actually modeling, I don't actually worry about the scale. I model out each asset, and then after I get the asset done, so our sword being the asset, I'll get everything done and then I'll kind of scale it to match the actual scene. So we'll talk about more about that as we go. Cool, so now what we're going to do is we're going to jump into edit mode. I'll jump to my selection. I'll select these points, these vertices right there. I'll do Shift F to zoom in just like that. Next up, what we'll do is we'll add a loop cut on this guy right there. So I'll select my loop cut and I'll just go over here, hit loop right there. So that's going to be the center of our blade. Next up, what we want to do is get rid of all of these faces along the side right here. And then we're going to weld the tops and the bottoms together. So I'll go into my face select right there. I'll select these like that. And what I'll do is I'll just go around this entire thing, just like that, while holding shift, just like that. And then I'll just hit delete, and then I'll delete faces just like that. Cool, so before we move any forward, we just want to make sure that we're working on the tip of the blade. And it doesn't really matter which one you make the tip, but if you want to follow along exactly with me, the tip of the blade that I'm working with is going to be a -y. So we have our X, Y, Z coordinates. So those are the directions of the world. So X being this way, Y being that way, and Z being up and down. So you notice how the Y is actually pointing that way, which means we're working currently, the tip is currently in -y. Cool, so we'll start merging these things together. So I'll go ahead and select this just like that. And what I'll do here is I'll go to Vertex, Merge Vertices at Center. And I'll just do those as well. So I'll select these, and to repeat that, what I'll do is just hit Shift R like that. So that's repeat last command. So that's another hotkey that we're going to add to our list. Just like that. I'll go down here, hit Shift F, and I'll do the same thing. I'll select these, Shift R, select these, hit Shift R. Cool, so now I'll go back to the other side. So you notice how that Shift F hotkey really allows us to kind of navigate the scene in an efficient way. So now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and hit our insert edge loop or our loop cut. And we'll go ahead and add a loop right there. And then what we'll do is we'll go into our selection tool. We'll select this. We'll select all three of these like that. We'll go into our scale tool like this. And what we want to do is we want to snap this to a scale of 0. So we'll just go ahead and hit 0 on our keyboard like that. And so while you're holding scale like that, so while you're holding scale like this, you just hit 0 on your keyboard, which will snap them like that. Cool, so we have a couple more loop cuts to do. So we'll go into our loop cut tool. We'll add one right there. We'll add one right there. And now what we'll do is we'll select our selection tool like this, like that. And we'll come in here and scale this. We want to scale this in like this, but we notice something interesting is going to happen in that our selection tool is not actually selecting the bottom of our blade, of our asset. So what we want to do here is undo out of that. what we'll do is we'll go into either wireframe mode or X-ray mode. I'm going to show you guys X-ray mode right here because it's a really good way to work when you're modeling. So now what we can do is we can actually see through our object, meaning we can actually select through it now too. So we'll go ahead and select our selection tool right there. I'll select these. I'll hit S and I'll go ahead and scale in like that. And then what I'll do is Shift F to zoom in and then scale up like that, just so it's a little bit more even like that. Cool. So now what we'll do is we'll go back to, the back. So we'll hit our selection tool. We'll select right there, hit Shift F to go back. And now what we'll do is we'll just select these two ends right there. We'll go into our selection tool and scale down just like that. Selection tool again. And then we'll go back to our scale tool and scale in just like that. And we'll scale up just like that as well. Cool. So at this point, we're almost finished. A couple more details to add in here. So we're going to add this little detail area down just right there. And what I'll do here is just add in a couple more loop cuts. And I'll click this and go down right there, just like that. And I'll do another one right here. I'll just click right there. And I'll do another one right there. And now what I'll do is I'll jump into my selection tool. And I'll select this area right here, this area right there. And go ahead and just scale those in like that. And then what I'll do here is I'll come in here and select these area right there, this area right there, and then jump back into our move tool and scale up just like that. So that levels that off right there. Cool. So now we'll go back into our object mode. And as you can see, this is still feeling very polygonal. So what we'll do is we'll go over to our modifier tabs and we'll start adding our bevels and our subdivisions. So what we want to do is we want to smooth it out. So if we go to modifier, we'll go to subdivision surface. But if you notice now, if we go into our wireframe mode, it's currently too smooth at this point. So what I'm going to do is add a bevel before it, and we can do add modifier bevel, but that's not actually fix anything. So what we want to do is actually move that bevel before the subdivision. So now if I go back into tab and we go to shaded mode, we can see it's looking much better. But you can see that we're still getting some polygon faces. So we'll go up here and we'll go to object and we'll go to shade smooth just like that, just to smooth it out. Cool. So one more tweak that we want to make is we want to kind of come in here and go back into our edit mode and go to our selection right here. And we'll just kind of scale this in a little bit right there. So that's our final blade. Again, this was kind of the toughest chapter to get through. So if you're struggling a little bit, take a step back, try the gear out a couple more times. Just know that as we move forward, everything is building off the same techniques that we're doing here. Cool. So next chapter, what we'll do is we'll start modeling out the guard of the sword. Cool. So now we're going to start modeling out the guard. Before moving forward, what I would do is just file, save right there. And it's always a good idea to just kind of come in here. After you make some good progress, just do file, save as, and then just version up right there. So I'm currently on version 3. You guys might be on version 2. And that'll just kind of give us a history of work in progress. So if we ever mess up and we want to go back, that's easy to do. So before we start moving forward, what I'm going to do is just prep the scene a little bit more. So up here in our outliner, we haven't spent much time in up here, but to start utilizing a little bit more, what we'll do is we'll just turn off camera and turn off light, and that'll just kind of keep them from getting in our way. And what I'll do here is go to my cube and I'll double click on that and I'll call that blade, just like that. Awesome. So before we add our object, we want to make sure that we're going to be in edit mode. So if you're in edit mode and you do add objects, it's actually going to be adding that object to this other object, and we don't want to do that. So make sure that each time we're starting a new object, we're in object mode. Cool. So to start, I'll go ahead and add mesh, add a cylinder. And I'll go ahead and zoom in on this so we can see it. I'll go to my little add cylinder tab down here. So what we want to do is adjust this vertices over to 12, just like that. And then we'll do cap fill, triangle fan, just like that. And if we jump into our wireframe mode right there, we can see what that does. So we go from being an n-gon, which is essentially an n-gon is a polygon that has more than 4 edges. And typically n-gons you want to kind of stay away from them. They don't subdivide easily, so they don't work the modifier stack very easily. So what we'll do now is we'll just choose triangle fan. And then what we'll do is we'll move this into place. And if you want to follow along, the exact settings that I'll use are going to be 044.8. We'll rotate it 90 degrees in X. And then we'll scale 2.2, 1.2, just like that. Cool. And now what we can do is just close down that cylinder tab. Cool. So to get going, we'll jump into edit mode. And again, you see everything selected right now. So what I'll do is just select my selection tool. I'll go off of it like that. And what I'm going to do here is go into my face selection just like this. And I'll select all my faces. So at this point, we want to select both the tops and the bottoms. And we'll just extrude in. And that's going to give us some better topology. Topology is a fancy word that we use for easily subdividable objects, easily animatable objects. So topology is kind of a big discussion. So just know that's a kind of a big thing. So for now, what we'll do is we'll just talk about how to fix this so that we can easily subdivide it later. So I want to select this right now, but I can't. So if I go over to smooth shaded and turn off X-ray, what I can do is actually select this stuff a little bit easier like that. So I'll select that, come over to the other side. If I want to be able to see what I'm doing a little bit better, what I can do is just go ahead and shut off the blade just like that. And I'll go ahead and select that like that. So now we have both of them. So now what we want to do is we want to go into our extrude region. And basically this is just a quick way for us to create some extra polygons without actually pushing anything out. So if we just click right here, basically what we just did right there was we did an extrusion, but the extrusion didn't actually go anywhere. It just made new polygons. And immediately what we're going to do after that is scale it in like this. And what you can see right now is we've created an edge loop right there. So we have a brand new edge loop that goes around right there. So that's topology. So now when we actually subdivide this, we can actually add some edge loops there. Again, topology is a bigger discussion. Cool. So at this point, what we want to do is we want to actually kind of chop off after this. So we don't actually have to model both sides of this guard. So in the last chapter where we did the sword, it was kind of an easy object. So doing both sides wasn't that difficult, but it's common practice to just model one side and then mirror it to the other side. So what I'm going to do here is just select this like that. I'm going to go to the other side, select this like that. And you notice we don't actually select all of them like that. So what I'm going to do is just go into my X-ray mode, and then select all of it like that. And then I'm going to hit delete, delete faces. So now what we can do is go into our modifiers. What we can do is modifier, we can add mirror just like that. And now you can see whatever we do on this side will mirror to the other. And again, this is non-destructive. So as we go, it'll just automatically be on the other side. Cool. So we'll leave that modifier on. We're still in edit mode. I'll go ahead and select these faces just like that. And while I'm in my standard extrude region tool just like that, I'll go ahead and just extrude this out just like that. And then I'll jump into my scale tool. I'll go ahead and scale it like this. And then I'll snap scale just like this. So I'll scale like that and hit 0 to snap scale, just like that. I'll go into my move tool. And I'll go ahead and just move this up a little bit, just like that. So you don't have to be exactly what I'm doing right here. So I'm kind of like tweak it a little bit as we go. I mean, kind of like move it around like that. So feel free to kind of tweak and play around. Next up, what I'm going to do is add a loop cut right there, and I'll just add a loop cut just like that. And then what we'll do is we'll jump into our selection tool. We'll come around here, go into our primitives, our faces right there, select these two, and do another extrusion up just like that. And now what we want to do is actually move this over like that. So essentially we're just going to eye this up to be right there. And then we'll go ahead, so we want to eye that up right there. And then go ahead and add in a new loop cut just like that. And then we'll go ahead and go into our selection tool, go into our face selection. We'll select these two right there. And then we'll just go ahead and extrude that out again, just like that. And this time what we'll do is we'll go ahead and switch over to our move tool to move that out just like that. We'll jump into our scale tool just like that. And we want to kind of just match the curvature of this right there. So we got it kind of like a consistent flow to that, like that. So this is going to take a little bit of eyeing up to do. So we'll move it out like that. Cool. So now we have the base shape. So now we add some bevels and add a subdivision. So we'll go back to our modifiers. We'll go to add, we'll go to bevel, and then what we'll do is add subdivision. Just like that. But if you notice, if we go over to our object mode, we can see something interesting happen here. If we do object, we'll do our shade or smooth shade like that. You can see we're still kind of seeing this kind of facet like that. It's because our bevel is currently beveling that. So if we go into our wireframe like that, and if we turn off our subdivision display, we can see that we're actually beveling this right there, which is not exactly what we want. So to fix that, we go into bevel, and we'll just click this little angle tab right there, which basically means if it's past this angle, it's not going to bevel the edges. So it's only going to do anything past 30 degrees, which is what we want because it's going to be our edges. So we'll change our width over to 0.01. We'll add segments being 2. And now what we'll do is we'll turn back on subdivision. But if you notice, we're getting something weird happening right now. If we go back into our shaded mode and turn off X-ray, we can see what's happening here. And this is another area where like, okay, this is bad topology happening right here. The operations that we're telling it to do with the subdivision and the beveling don't have good topology, therefore they're not going to actually smooth and do what they want correctly. So just like before where we added that edge loop, we want to add some more loops in here as well. So what we'll do is we'll go into our loop cut tool right here. We'll click right here and we'll just drag this all the way to the edge right there. And we'll do the same thing right there. And that's going to clean that up for us. And you'll notice that we have the same thing happening over here. So we'll add some edge loops there to clean up that topology, just like that. Cool, so now if we want to see this along with the blade, we can do that. Cool, so that's wrapping up for the blade. And in the next chapter, what we'll do is we'll start modeling out the handle. All right, so now we're going to start modeling out the handle. So making sure that we're starting in object mode, I'll go to add mesh, we'll do cylinder. And in our cylinder properties down here, what I'll do is change my vertices to 12, just like that. And then we'll do cap type and we'll just do nothing right there. And we'll go ahead and just close that out. And then the exact settings, I'm going to move this to start with. I'm going to start in 0, 51, 0, 90 degrees rotation in X, and then 1, 0.62 and 5.3. So that's just going to put us all in the same spot. So we all have the same, so we're all starting off working in the same place. So now I'll go ahead and zoom in here. And the first thing that I'll do is I'll jump into edit mode. And again, it turns all brown because everything's selected. If we want to deselect, all we have to do is go into our selection tool and select like that. I'll go into my vertex, and what I'll do is I'll go ahead and scale this down. So I'll jump into my scale tool and I'll just go ahead and scale this in like that, just a little bit. And now what we'll do is we'll start adding some edge loops. So we'll do loop cut right here. So we'll start clicking right here and we'll add a couple different ones just like that. So it's 7 total. And now what we'll do is we need to add a bevel. So essentially we're going to add another edge loop here and extrude it out. But before we do that, we'll go ahead and add a bevel. So what we want to do is go into our selection mode again. We'll go into edge mode using our hotkeys. And I'll just come down here and shift select all of these edges. And by doing that, we can then go into select and we'll do loops, select edge loops. So that's going to select all of them so that we can modify all of them together. Cool. So now what we want to do is we want to add a bevel, and a bevel is another one of our polygon tools. So we talked about bevel as in a modifier. Now we're talking about bevel as a polygon modeling tool, which is essentially going to be the same operation, just one's going to be non-destructive, one's going to be destructive. So we're going to want to use this one, which is the destructive one, which means basically it's baked into our model. So what I'll do here is select that, and we'll just do is click and drag like this. So we'll just do a little bit like that. And if you notice if it's a little bit of wonky right there, you might have to like zoom out to see everything. Basically, our bevel tool is starting from this little circle right there. So you want to start there and go out like that. Cool. So now we'll add just another edge loop just like this. In between all of those just like that. And then what we'll do is we'll jump into our selection tool and we'll select another edge loop just like this. So now we're selecting every other one. So we don't want the ones that we beveled out already. We want the ones that we haven't beveled out already. So now we'll select all of those. We'll go to select and then we'll do select loops, select edge loops like that. And now what we can do is we can simply jump into our scale tool and then scale this up and scale this out like that. And we're going to kind of exaggerate it a little bit like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a subdivision smooth on top of this to kind of smooth everything out. So we'll go to settings, add modifier, and we'll do subdivision surface. Great. And we can kind of tweak this now that we can see everything together. We can kind of tweak this if we want. If we want a little bit less like that. Cool. So we'll go to just viewport. We'll do 2 subdivisions like that. And then what we'll do is we'll just go up into our object mode like that. And again, we got our hard edges right here. So to smooth those out, we'll go to object, shade, smooth, just like that. Cool. So that wraps it up for the handle. And then in the next chapter, what we'll do is we'll start modeling out the final piece to the sword. All right, so we'll start modeling out the final piece to the sword. So what we'll do here is we'll go to object mesh, and we'll go ahead and add in a torus. So this is going to be another object that we haven't worked with yet. So torus, and then I'll go ahead and zoom in here. I'll go into my wireframe mode right there. And what I'll do here is I'll just change the radius down like this. And what I'm going to do is just do a 0.1 value, just like that. Cool. And then all we have to do is move it. And the exact values that I'm going to use here are going to be 0, 56.3, and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees in X. Then I'm going to scale it down to be 0.68. And then we'll just make sure that we're doing that 0.68 scale in X, Y, and Z, just like that. Cool. So I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this. So I'll just go right click, duplicate objects, and I'll go ahead and just hit enter. So back with our Minecraft project, we learned that enter just drops the duplicate, so then we can then move it. So if we go into our move tool, we can move it down like this. And the exact values that I used here was 62.675. And then scale is going to be 0.61. This is going to be a little bit smaller. Cool. So we need one more object. So while we're still in object mode, we're going to go to add mesh cylinder. Our radius is going to be 12, like that. We're going to do caps. We're going to do nothing. And then again, we're going to move it. The exact values I use is 0, 59.58, 90 degrees, and 0.719, and 3.128, just like that. If you're wondering where I'm getting these number ones, this is just because I've built this already. So I kind of like have all these settings ready to go in my notes over here. So it's a little bit easier for us. Cool. So what we're going to do here is just make sure that we have our scale like this. So now what we're going to do is essentially scale down each one of these edges. So we'll jump into edit mode. Again, it's brown because it's selecting everything. If we want to deselect, we'll go into our selection mode and deselect like that. We'll go into our vertex mode, select this, and then jump into our scale and scale down just like that. And I'll go ahead and jump into my move tool and move it in just like that. And now we'll jump back to our selection over here. So I'm still working in wireframe and X-ray mode over here. And we'll go ahead and just, again, if you ever find yourself struggling with selecting things, you might be kind of in the wrong mode. So like, for example, if I go into shaded mode, if I try to select all this right here, like that, if I jump into scale, you notice we get something weird where the other side isn't scaling. So be very careful when you're working like this. So I'm either always in like X-ray mode or X-rated in shaded mode or wireframe mode, just so I can see through all of it. So I'll go ahead and select this. I'll just scale that down just like that. And now what I want to do is jump back into my selection tool, select all these like this, just like that. And I'll jump into my scale tool again and scale down just like that. Cool. So next up, we'll just smooth it out. So we'll add a subdivision surface. So we'll do modifier, subdivision surface like that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into object mode. And then what we do here is we'll just go to object, shade smooth to smooth that out. Cool. So we have one more object that will wrap up the sword. So what we'll do is we'll add object mesh cylinder. This time the cap, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to choose triangle fan, which again will just add tries instead of being an empty end gone or no cap at all. 12, and then I'll just go ahead and close that down. The exact settings I'm going to move it to are going to be 0, 63.78. I'm going to scale it 1.23, and then 0.398. Just like that. I'll go ahead and zoom in here and I'll start to get to work on it. So at the top, we need to add a loop here so that we can extrude it out. So I don't want to have to model the tops and the bottom. So what I'll do here is I'll take advantage of the mirror modifier again. So what I'll do is I'll go into edit mode. I'll select my vertices. I'll select my faces rather at the bottom. I'll select that like that. So I'll select all these. You notice again, it's kind of hard to select here. So what I'll do is I'll turn off X-ray mode. So again, sometimes you want it, sometimes you don't. I'll just select that like that. I'll hit delete. I'll delete faces, just like that. And then what I'll do here is go into vertex selection mode, select like that. And then I'll go ahead and go into my move tool. But before I move this, what I do is I want to snap it to the grid. So what I'll do is I'll turn on my snap mode right here. I'll go into the options right here and I'll do absolute grid snap just like that. And when I move it, it'll snap to that grid just like that. We'll go into our faces, we'll select that. We'll do extrude region just like this. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my snap mode. I'll go ahead and move it down like this and scale it in like this. And then I'll do another extrusion inward like that. And just another one like that, which will just add another edge loop there. And then I'll click this like this and then just go into my scale tool and scale that in like there. So that's just us adding some edge loops so we have some good topology there, so that when we smooth it, it'll smooth properly. Cool. So, and then the last step that we have to do to wrap up the sword model is we'll go ahead and we'll select the ends right here. We'll go into extrude region, just like that, and we'll push that out like that. And then we'll go ahead and jump into our selection mode. And then what we want to make sure that we do is that go down here and select these faces like this. And we'll go ahead and just delete faces. We'll select the tops just like that. And then from there, what we'll do is we'll select the tops like this. We'll go ahead and move these down like that. And then I'll just jump into my selection. And I'll just jump into my selection tool again, move those back like that, and then in like that, and then scale those in like that. Cool. And then from there, all we have to do is mirror and subdivide it. So we'll go to our modifier stack. We'll go to mirror. And then instead of mirroring it in X, what we'll do is we'll mirror it in Z, like that. Cool. And then before we subdivide it, what we'll want to do is add some edge loops, just like this. We'll add one right there, one right there. And basically what this is going to do is when we smooth it, it's going to make sure that these edges right here are nice and tight. Just like that. Cool. And then what we'll do is add modifier. We'll do subdivision surface, just like that. If we go back into our object mode, we'll notice that we see the polygons again. We'll go to object and then shade smooth, just like that. A couple of things we want to do is just make sure that on this torus right here, we'll just do shade smooth on that as well. And then object shade smooth on that as well. Cool. So that is wrapping it up for the model of the sword. Cool. So in the coming chapters, what we'll do is we'll start introducing materials, textures, and UVs as well. Okay, so before we can start actually texturing and shading the sword asset, we're going to need to take a look at UVs. So what are UVs? UVs are essentially the 2D version of our 3D objects. So any object in 3D that's going to have a texture assigned to it needs to have UVs. So to take a look at this, I'm just in this default scene. I'm going to add a sphere object. I'm going to move it over like this. And we'll just take a look at what the UVs look like on both of these objects. So if we go over to UV editing, so our cube is now brown again. What that means is we're currently in edit mode. So if I tab out of edit mode, you notice we don't see the UVs anymore. So if I go over here and select the sphere and tab into that edit mode, you can see we see the sphere. So this is a 2D representation of this 3D object, which means we can assign a texture to it. So just a quick tour of the UV editor in Blender. Some quick tips in here. I'm just going to sync our selection. So this will basically just make our selection sync with our viewport. That'll just make things kind of a little bit easier as we go. If we want to alter these UVs, we have this UV tab right here. And we have a couple different ways that we can project. So we have like cube projection right there. We have cylinder projection, and we have sphere projection. You can see these are all the projections are just ways that we can modify the UVs. We can do smart UV pack, for example. We can do project from view. For now, what I'm going to do is just do a cube projection on this because it's a cube. Where we're going to be spending a lot of time over here in the UV view is in this UV menu. So this is where we take our projections and we modify them. So if we want to do something like pack islands, what is pack islands? Islands are essentially going to be the shells of our UVs, and we'll talk about more of that about that as we go. Cool. So if I tap out of that and go into object mode and go over to my sphere and tap inside of there, we can start modifying this as well. A couple hotkeys that we're going to want to get to know really well for this is going to be to select and deselect all. So if I do double tap A, it'll deselect. A will select. And that just makes it easy to grab the entire object. So when we do our projections. So I'm going to do UV. We can test a couple out. We have like cube projection. We have cylindrical. We have sphere. We have smart UV unpacked. So again, just different ways to convert the 3D object over into 2D space. Cool. So as we go, we'll start talking about some more tools and techniques to UV out the sword. All right, so I'm back in my sword asset, and before I do anything here, what I'm going to do is just version up again. So if we make any mistakes, we can always come back to this final model version that we have. So I'm going to save that and then go to Save As. I'm going to just version this up to version 4 and then just do Save As Blender File. Cool. So before I move any further, I want to kind of clean up our scene up a little bit. So we have our blade and then we have our guard right here. So what I'm going to do is go over here to my outliner and just rename this. So I'll double click on this, call this guard. I'll go down to the handle, double click on that and call that handle. And for the bottom, where we have our Pommel, this little bottom part of the sword, what I'm going to do is make a new collection, which you can think of as kind of like a group. And we can do that right here. So new collection. So we'll just rename that to Pommel. And then what I'll do is go ahead and drag and drop. So I'll shift select all of these just like that. And I'll drag and drop all of these into Pommel. And then I'll just leave it at that. Cool. So I'll just go ahead and save that out. And to start here, what I'm going to do is select my sword asset. And if I jump into wireframe here, you'll notice that we have a pretty big difference between what we see in the standard mesh mode and what we see with our modifier stacks. So when we get into texturing, if we're modifying the geometry too much, too dramatically, like if it's going from a really low poly cage to a pretty dense object, there can be a lot of discrepancies between the actual texture that we paint on and the final result. So what I'm going to do here is just bake this in like this. So I'll go to my modifier, I'll go to my bevel, and I'll just go to apply. So it's basically baking it into the mesh. It's no longer a non-destructive mesh. Then I'll go to my subdivision and I'll just make sure that my viewport and render is set to 1 and 1, and I'll just hit apply. So we're not subdividing too much. We're only going to subdivide it once, and then we'll work with that. Great. So with my blade selected, I'm going to jump over to UV editing. And you'll notice when we come over here, we don't see anything. If we make sure if we jump into object mode, basically what we want to do is make sure that we have our sword selected over here. And then what we'll do is we'll jump into edit mode, and then we'll do select all, or you can hit that hotkey A. And you notice our UVs right here are pretty disastrous. They're not usable at all. So essentially our job right now is to fix these, to get these UVs looking good. So essentially the process we're going to do is essentially cut it in 2 different pieces and then do a planar projection of both sides. So first thing I need to do is come in here. I'm going to go into my select tool. I'll go to my edge select like that. I'll go ahead and select this edge, and I'll do select loops, edge loop, just like that. And then what I'll do from there is I'll go to UVs, mark seam. So that is us telling Blender that this edge right here is there's going to be a seam in the UVs. Great. So now what I'll do is I'll go ahead and go to select and go to all again, or you can use the hotkey A. And I'll go to UV, unwrap. And essentially what we see here is that we get these 2 different shells. So you can call these UV shells, you can call them UV islands. Whatever they are, what we did was we just separated them. They're not perfect, so we're going to make them a little bit better. So what I'm going to do here is go into my selection mode, go into face mode, and if you ever have trouble like this where you can't actually see these UVs, I always like to work with this sync UV selection. And basically what that means is it just forces the UVs to display regardless of our selection. And it keeps our selections tied between the viewport and the UV shell. So what I'm going to do is just make sure I select none. So I'll just do select none like this. And then what I'll do is I'll hover over this and I'll hit L. But you notice that it says select linked only works in face selection mode. So what I'm going to do is go to face selection mode and hit L. And basically what we did is we just selected a UV island or a UV shell. And now what I'm going to do is while this is selected, I'm going to do a projection on this side alone. So what I'll do now is go to View, I'll go to Viewport, and I'll go to Top. And what I'll do here is I'll just navigate like this, just so we can make sure that we see everything like that. And then I'll go to UV, Project from View. So in other words, that's going to be a planar projection, meaning it's a 2D projection. Cool. And then what I'll do is I'll just do select none, or you can do Alt A or double tap A. And then what I'll do is I'll hover over here and hit L again. And then with that selected, what I'm going to do is go to View. I'm going to go to Viewports. I'm going to go to Bottom. Now it's going to flip it upside down. And then I'm going to go to UV, Project from View again. Great. So now what we want to do is we actually want to arrange these things. So they're sticking on top of each other now. So we have to actually lay them out. So what I'm going to do here is go to Select. We'll do Select All. And I'll go over to my UV view. I'll do Average Island Scales. So that basically just makes sure that they're both the same scale. And then I'll do UV Pack Islands. So in a perfect world, we would, we would rotate these things and kind of stretch them across. It's important to kind of take advantage of as much space of the UV shell as possible, strictly so that our texture resolution is going to benefit this model as much as possible. But for the sake of the tutorial, I'm just going to leave them like this. We're not trying to win any awards with these UVs or anything. So we just want to get it good enough so that we can make something cool out of the tutorial. Cool. So at this point, we want to actually see these things to make sure that we actually can view them. So what I'll do here is I'll go into my object mode, or by hitting tab, go to my material right here, and I'll go to the material right here, and I'll go to base color. I'll go to checker texture, just like that. And what I'll do here is I'll go into my, it's a little bit hard to see, so I'm going to drag this over like that. I'm going to go into my look dev view. I'm going to make sure my metallic slider is all the way down. And now we can actually see this texture. But we need to take it a step further because the UVs are not actually communicating with this shader yet. So what we have to do is go to Vector and then go to UV right there. And that's just going to make sure that the checkerboard and the UVs are actually communicating. Great. And then we'll just take the scale of the checkerboard and we'll do something like 50. And now we can check this out, how we actually have proper UVs. Great. So I'll go ahead and save this out just like that. And next up, I'll start to build out the rest of the UVs, starting with the guard. So to start building out the guard UVs, what I'll do here is while I'm in object mode, I'll just go to my selection right here. I'll go to zoom in on this. And what we want to do here is we want to, again, collapse our modifier stack. And we're going to do that because basically our modifiers are currently mirroring this. And we're going to run into the same subdivision and beveling issues where if we're doing too much modifications on this before our UVs are applied to this, then we can run into some issues when we actually assign our texture. So what I'll do now is just go into here, I'll go to apply, and I'll just apply all of these modifiers like that. And I'll just make sure that my subdivisions are set to 1, and I'll hit apply just like that. Great. So now what I can do is if I go over to my material, what I can do is come in here and select that material that we already have right there. So that material is basically that default material that we have in our scene. So we're essentially taking this material and assign it to this so we can actually see what we're doing. And as you can see, we need to do some work because right now it's super broken. So I'll go into edit mode by hitting tab. And now what we can do is we can see the UVs here. And what I'm going to do here is just go to select all, or you can hit A on your keyboard. And what I'm going to do here is just do UV, smart UV project. So it's a different way to project. It's kind of like an automatic way inside of Blender. And basically what that's going to do is just give us some default UVs to work with. We're not going to be doing anything special. And again, we're not trying to win the Hall of Fame with these UVs here. We just want to kind of get it good enough so that our shaders are going to look good at the end. So we're keeping it super simple. Again, to kind of hit this hard, UVs can get really complicated, so we're just going to keep it super basic for now. You can see here we got a little bit of a stretching happening right here. So just to give you guys some exposure on how to fix that stuff when that comes up, what we want to do here is we'll just select none. And then what we'll do is come over to our UVs over here, and we'll just hit L over this to select that, and we'll hit L over this. And then what we'll do is we'll jump into our scale tool like this. And instead of scaling uniformly like this, what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and hit X. So we have the two hotkeys. We talked a little bit about these earlier, but specifically in the viewport, we actually changed our hotkeys to work a different way. But here we're going to want to use these hotkeys. So it's X and Y. So what X will do on our scale tool, basically as I'm dragging like this, I'm going to hit X on my keyboard, and that'll basically just snap it to be stretching in the X mode. And what you can see here is we can actually fix that stretching that we see so that those checkerboard patterns are perfect squares. Great. The rest of it's looking pretty decent. Nothing that we need to be too concerned about. Again, not perfect, but good enough for now. Cool. And then what I'll do is I'll just go to select all, or you can hit A on the keyboard. And then what I'll do is UV, I'll do average island scale, and then UV pack islands. And that'll basically just make sure that they're all on the same scale, and then they'll just lay it out so that we can work with it later. Great. So that's done. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and file save. And then I'll go back into my object mode, or you can hit tab on the keyboard. I'll select this, which is the handle. And then we'll just go ahead and assign this material. So in our material, we'll go to assign material. And that'll basically just give it the checkerboard pattern. And as you can see here, we already got some pretty decent UVs. Because we started with that cylinder primitive, just like the cube and the sphere, this one came with UV, so we don't have to do that much to it. We did do some modifications, so we do want to clean this up a little bit. So what I'll do is I'll jump into edit mode. I'll go to select all, or by hitting A on your keyboard. And then what I'm going to do is scale this. So basically all we have to do to fix this is just essentially fix the scale. As you can see that we got a little bit of stretching right here, so our squares on our checkerboard is a little bit rectangular, so we want to fix that. So we'll go over here, we'll go to our scale. I'll just click and drag like this, but then what I'll do is I'll just hit X on my keyboard so I can do that right there. And I'll just drag up and down until those things become squares and not rectangles, just like that. Cool. So this one's looking pretty good. So I'll just tab out of that, and I'll just leave the modifiers on for this because there's not that much stretching going on. In fact, it's looking pretty good overall. So what I'll do now is just file, save. Great. And then what I'll do is come down here and I'll just assign materials to all these. So that's going to be our checkerboard pattern like that. And I'll just keep going down to do all of this. And essentially this one's going to be a little bit more tricky because essentially we want to have all of these going to be in the same material, but they're going to be different objects. So there's going to be a slightly different techniques that we're going to use here, which is going to be important for you guys moving forward on your other projects. What we'll do is these toruses come with pretty decent UVs. Again, they're pretty small. They're a little stretched out like that. So we can fix those, and we'll fix these and we'll fix those. Basically, we'll just treat everything one by one by one. And then at the end, what we'll do is we'll just pack them all together. So in this torus, what we'll do is we'll jump into edit mode. We'll just go into our scale, start scaling this like this, and just do that like that. But you can see it's actually, we need to stretch it the other way. So as I scale, I'll just hit Y, which will stretch those checkerboard patterns out just like that. Great. And then what I'll do is for the other one, I'll jump out of edit mode just like that, select this, and then I'll jump into edit mode just like that. And then I'll start scaling. I'll hit Y to snap my scale just like that. And I'll just keep moving this down until I get the perfect squares. Great. So I'll tab out of that, and then I'll just select this one and tab into that. And as you can see here, again, we got some pretty decent UVs, even though we modified this. So there's some pretty decent UVs to start with. So what I'll do is I'll just make sure I select all. I'll go over here and I'll jump into my scale, and then I'll just scale with X like that until these things become more like squares. Great. So we'll just tab out of that. So this one, we technically have a lot of modifiers going on. So we'll want to bake those down as well. So I'll just go to apply and then apply. And now what we'll do is we'll jump into edit mode. And then what I'll do is I'll just do select all, and then we'll do UV, smart UV project, and hit OK. Again, this is a pretty complicated shape. So that's just a kind of a quick way for us to get some sort of UVs to work with. Again, if you look in the cinematic, this end piece is super, super tiny. And as we would say in production, this is good enough for now. If we need to come back and fix it later, we can always do that. So I'll just tab out of that. And now what I'll do is I'll go in my selection mode, and I'll select all of these like this. And then what I'll do is while all these are selected, go into tab mode. And essentially now we're essentially modifying all of these at the same time. And what I'll do is I'll go to select, and we'll go to select all. And then from here, what I'll do is in my UV editor, I'll go to average island scale. And basically that's going to just attempt to make sure everything is kind of like functioning on the same scale. And then we'll go to UVs, pack island. So nothing's going to be overlapping. And I'll go ahead and tab out of that. I'll go ahead and save. Great. So that was UVs. And UVs are not a fun process, but they're necessary to get the job done. So the techniques that I used here, you can use on a lot of different objects to do just very basic UVs. And just know that even though the UVs that we're working with right now are not perfect, even in production, stuff like this is happening all the time. We only ever want to work as much as we need to. If the UVs don't need to be perfect, then we're not going to attempt to make them perfect. So we're taking shortcuts and cheats like this all the time. Cool. So in the next lesson, what we'll do is we'll start taking a look at texturing the sword. Okay, so we're officially getting out of the modeling stage. So we're now moving into the shader phase. So inside of the downloads that are in the description, I'll provide this sword that we're starting with here. So if you just want to start here and just do the shader work, you can follow along just by using this. As we go, you'll start to find that this part is a lot more creative and a bit less technical than the modeling side. So I encourage you, if you really, really like this part and not the modeling part, just know that, people in the industry, they specialize in one or the other a lot of times. Sometimes, you'll see, a lot of times you'll see, people do modeling, texturing, and shading. Sometimes you see people just model. Sometimes you'll see people just do shaders. Great. So now we're going to jump into the shading tab. Cool. So what are we looking at here? So there's a couple new things that we need to take a look at. So our 3D viewport right here is basically the same viewport that we've been working in. It's currently set to be in look dev mode. So we see the look dev mode be right here. So this is shaded. This is look dev. So this look dev mode is meant to be like a fast preview mode of what these materials are going to be. It's currently in the EV render. Down here, we're going to see our material node graph, so our shader node graph. And essentially, this is going to be a whole new world that we're jumping into. It's a node-based workflow. So each one of these things that you see right here is a node. And essentially, everything that we see here, we've already built together using the properties panel. So whenever we went over to material, did new material, assigned the checkerboard, assigned the UVs, we were already building this network out just by doing that. So you can see our checker texture right here is actually right there. Our UV texture coordinates are actually right there. So we've already built this. So to show you a bit around right here, if you ever like do this and you all of a sudden get lost or stuck, you just go up to view and then just do view all, or you can hit home on your keyboard and that'll just snap you back to seeing all the nodes here. So first off, to kind of break down what we see here, this material output, whatever we have plugged into the surface is what we're actually going to display. So if I actually click and drag off like this, we'll actually disconnect that. And if we click this little green circle right here and drag and connect it back like that, and then let go, we're going to be connecting it. If you want to make new stuff, all you have to do is go up to add, and we have a whole list of nodes that we can create here. We'll touch up on more of this as we go. So currently this material that we have is our checker material that we've been working with. And what I'm going to do right now is just rename this. I'm going to put underscore, then I'm going to put checkers, just like that, just so we know that that material is there. If we want to swap materials, we have this little pull down right here. And if we want to go to other objects and start tweaking or making new shaders, what we can do here is if we select here, you'll notice that each time we select here, we're just working with the same shader style. So that's because we assign the same material to all of these objects. If we want to create new materials for these objects, what we can do here is if I just go to this blade right here, what I'm going to do is just hit this little X right here, which is basically just going to remove that material connection from that object. And now what I can do is just hit new. And now basically we have a brand new shader. So what I'm going to do here is just rename this material, and I'm going to call this blade. So now we have this blade material. Now if we do this little pull down right here, we can see that we have a blade shader and we have our material checkers shader. So before we get too far into this, just make sure that you're currently set on object mode and not in world mode. So world mode is going to be environment shaders. So when we get into part 3 and when we start doing atmosphere, we'll do that in here. But for now, we'll just stick in object mode. So object mode is going to display whatever we have selected like this. Cool. So what we'll do in the next chapter is we'll start building out the shaders for the sword. Great. So now what we're going to do is we're going to build out a base shader for this entire asset, starting with the blade. And then after we build out our first shader network, what we can do is actually we can copy and paste that to all of the other objects and then just tweak it a little bit from there. So I'll show you how to do that when we get there. So while I have blade selected here and we have our new blade material, what I'm going to do here is just go in here and tweak a couple settings. And you can see that there's a lot of settings here. We're not even going to touch up on half of this just because we don't really need to. So we're going to focus on building a hard surface shader. So whenever you're building hard surface shaders, and what I mean by hard surface is that it's not going to be organic like skin or character. It's going to be something that's manufactured, something that's metallic like or plastic. Great. So the main parameters that we want to be working with is going to be base color. So we can change the color like this. I'm going to leave this to be white for now. We have metallic. So is it something like plastic or is it something like metal? You notice right now we don't actually see much of a difference. We see a little bit, but basically if we play with our specular roughness, you can see we get a shiny reflection. And if I bring this up, this roughness, we get blurry reflection. We can see that a little bit better if we move our metallic slider all the way up just like that. Now if I can play with this roughness right here. So you can see as the roughness is lower, it gets clear. And as the roughness gets higher, it gets diffused. And then we have specular amount right here, which is basically going to be how much reflection we have. I'm going to leave this all the way up, but basically that is more important when we have metallic down. So when you have metallic down, it's more in like a plastic phase. And if I go up and down like this, you can see that's increasing that specularity. We can see a little bit better if I go to base color and turn that down right there. If I go up and down on the specular, we can see the highlights going up and down. Cool, so I'm just gonna leave this up like that. Cool, so the next one that we wanna get to know is just gonna be emission. So the runes that are actually gonna glow on this, we're gonna do that with emission. We're gonna get to this in a bit, but basically if we want this to glow, that's how we do that. So I'm just gonna leave it black for now, and we'll get to that when we start painting. So basically what I'll do now is I'll just go in and start adding some grunge to this. So I'll just make sure this is all the way in metallic. I'm gonna leave my roughness somewhere around 0.1 or 0.2, something like that. But we're gonna plug a texture into that, and I'm gonna show you how to do that right now. So if I go to add, we can go to search, and what I'm gonna do is search for image texture. And I'll just go ahead and hit enter, which will bring it out like this, and we'll just click to drop it like that. And basically this is a blank texture, right? So we can either make a new one, which we'll get into when we start painting, or we can actually bring one in outside of Blender. So what I'm gonna do is go to open, and then in the downloads, so in the description, there'll be a link to download these textures. And what I'm gonna do is go to that downloads directory. So feel free to like just drag it on your desktop or something if you wanna be able to get to it quickly. Or what I did right now is just copied and pasted the path in here. I'm going to scratches here. I'm gonna go open image. Great, so now we've brought this texture in here. And what I'm gonna do here is assign it to this shader. So I'm gonna show you what not to do. And what not to do is basically plug this color into base color, which is basically how I see a lot of people when they're first starting out do a metallic shader. And you can see when we look around right here, it doesn't look metallic at all. It looks like this weird scratchy pattern on top of something that's reflective. And basically with metallic materials, it's not the base color that tells the story, it's going to be the roughness channel that tells the story. So the base color is usually pretty simple, and then the roughness is actually where a lot of the details happen. So if I drag this out like this, and I go to this color like that, and just plug this into roughness, you can see if we zoom in here, we're starting to get a lot of these details, and it's actually looking pretty decent. So what if I want to control this further? So another node that I like to use in here is a ramp node. So I'll go to add, I'll go to search, I'll go to color ramp. And then what I'll do is I'll just take this and I'll hover over this little noodle right here, and I'll just click it down like that, and actually we'll just insert it like that. Or you can always just manually disconnect and reconnect. So basically what this color remap is doing is basically it's going to remap our white and black values. Before we move any further though, we want to make sure that this scratch map is linearized. Linearize, we got this color space thing down here called sRGB. We're going to switch it over to linear. What do these things mean? Linear workflow is a huge discussion, and basically it wasn't until like maybe 3 years into actually working in production where I really felt that I grasped the concept of linear workflow. I'll do more videos on this kind of stuff in the future, but for now, basically we're just going to switch this to linear, and the reason why we're doing that is because we don't want Blender to kind of try to correct these things in any way, because we're going to plug it into roughness. If this were going to go into base color, we would leave it to be sRGB, which is basically trying to display it correctly. I know that's all super confusing, but just know for now for the scratch map specifically, what we want to do is switch it to linear. And you can see what actually happened was now we're getting a lot more detail. And that's because it's not actually trying to do any gamma correction. And again, I know it's confusing. So basically now what I will do is we'll play around with these blacks and white points. So we can actually crunch this up and down like this to actually get more and less detail going on right there. So I'll just tweak it to be something like that. Cool, so now what we want to do is actually add this to be a bump map as well. And what I'm going to do here is add in another color ramp. And I'll just lay this down just like that. And I'll just go ahead and plug this into there. And then what I'll do here is I want to plug this into a bump map. And essentially what a bump map is going to do is give us details that look like it's actually geometry, but it's actually just texture based. I'll show you what that means right now. So we'll do search, we'll do bump, I hit enter, I'll plug that down like that, and then I'll plug color into height, and I'll plug normal into normal just like that. And you can see right here what we get is this thing that now looks like the geometry is made up of a lot of detail. So that is a bump map. So from here, what we want to do is play around with the distance and the strength. So I'll go ahead and take the strength down a lot. I'll go ahead and set this to something like 0.1. But you notice it still kind of feels like aluminum foil. Basically what we want to do now with this color ramp is kind of crunch these values a bit so that those large gashes are showing up, but not really much else. So there's a lot of like high frequency details in that map. So I'll just crunch it like that until we see that. But if you notice something else, the bump details are actually going outwards. We want them to go in. So what we'll do is here is go to distance and we'll do -1, which will just flip those to go inward. Cool, so at this point, we got a pretty decent shader. What if we actually want to make these scratches larger or smaller? So right now they're pretty big. So what we're going to do is we're going to make them smaller. So we have to do what's called tiling the texture. And how we do that is basically we have to plug a vector into here. So what we'll do is we'll go to add, we'll go to search, we'll go to texture coordinate, just like that. I'll lay that down like that and I'll put my UVs into this vector. And now it's going to actually be communicating with the UVs properly. But now if we want to actually tile this thing, we want to make the scratches larger or smaller, we're going to go to add, we're going to search for mapping, just like that. And I'll go ahead and plug that in. Again, I just dragged and dropped that over top of that noodle. So now we'll leave all this to default settings except for scale. And what we'll do is we can go here and just type in 2. So another way to do this is if you select all of these like this, and then we can just change them all at once. So I'm going to leave this around something like 3, or maybe we'll do something like 2. That's looking pretty good. Great, so now that we built this shader, it's a pretty universal setup for any kind of scratchy, hard surface, metallic shader. So instead of rebuilding this from scratch, what we can do is just copy and paste this to the other networks. All right, so don't forget, when you're ready to follow along, in the description below, what you'll find is these screenshots. Just go ahead and click any one of them, and then you'll get presented with a step-for-step, button-for-button, hotkey for hotkey, the exact process of what you need to recreate each chapter. Instead of rebuilding this from scratch, what we can do is just copy and paste this to the other networks. So what I'll do here is I'll select all of these, I'll right-click, I'll go to copy, or you can just do Control-C, or Command-C on a Mac. I'll copy those and I'll go over here, and then what I'll do here is just make a new material. So I currently have my material checkers here. What I'll do is exit out of that. I'll go to New. I'll go ahead and change this name to be Guard. And then what I'll do here is get rid of this. I'll just delete that. And then I'll just paste the shader network in here. And then I will drag and drop this noodle into surface. And then I'll just basically make it the output. And all we got to do here to modify this is actually just play with the tiling of the scale of this and change the color. So if you want to just use the same values that I used in the cinematic, what I'll do is 0.597. I'll tap through that. I'll do 0.463512. These are pretty specific, but that's just kind of what it was. And then I'll do 0.2844. And that's the exact color that I used in the cinematic. And again, I'm on the RGB tab right here. Cool. So if we want to change the tiling a little bit, just to play around with that, what we can do is maybe set the tiling to 1 here, since this is a bit of a smaller piece. Great. And then again, I'm just going to do a file save here. I'm going to name this shaded. So if you guys want to play around with this exact file, it'll be under sword final shaded. Great, and then what I'll do is I'll just keep going down the list here. So these materials down here are going to have the same shader. So what I'm going to do is just take this and copy this exact setup. So right click, copy, or you can hit Command-C or Control-C. And then what I'll do is I'll come down here, I'll select all of these, and what I'll do is just exit out of all of them like that. I'll just kind of go through here like that and exit out of them. Just like that. And then what I'll do here is I'll just do New. I'll paste that. I'll get rid of this. I'll plug that in. Just like that. And then what I'll do is I'll just call this material Pommel. And then what I'll do is I'll take this Pommel shader and just assign it to the rest of them. So it's a little bit different than what we did up here. That's mainly the reason why we're not just assigning this shader to this is because this is actually on a different UV coordinates. So I'll keep going. I'll select this. I'll just go to material and then I'll do Pommel. And then I'll do the same thing. So Pommel and then Pommel, just like that. Great. So we have one more shader to do. And then we'll just do this. So we'll come in here. I'll just go ahead and again exit out of this, just like that. I'll create a new shader. I'll call this handle, just like that. And I'll get rid of this. Just hit delete. And I'll paste this in here and then plug that in just like that. And then I'll just go ahead and make this something dark like this. I'll just bring that luminance value down just like that. And here we're actually going to want to tweak this a little bit because this handle, if we rotate around this like this, it's actually supposed to be kind of a rubber. So this material properties isn't quite there. So what I'll do here is I'll just go down on the metallic like this. And then from there, you can see it's still pretty glossy. So what I'll do here is in my color remap ramp, that's going into my roughness. What we can do is just bring down the white, which will just basically make it a bit more diffused. And I'll bring up that black value just like that. Cool. And if it's still too shiny from there, what I can do is just bring down the specular just like that. So I can just leave a little bit on there just like that. And that'll be more of like a rubberish material. Great. So that's wrapping up for the base shaders of the sword. And then in the next chapter, what we'll do is we'll start taking a look at how to texture paint and actually how to get these runes to start glowing. All right, so now we'll look at the basics of texture painting within Blender. One of my favorite things about Blender is that you can actually just texture paint directly inside the package. And when coming from like programs like Maya or Houdini, Maya sorta has it, but it's pretty clunky, and Blender's is actually really great. So I'll show you the basics in this chapter, and the next chapter what we'll do is we'll actually get going with it. So to get going, we actually need a texture to start with. We can either bring in a new one or we can create a fresh one inside of Blender. So I'll just create a fresh texture. Before I do anything, I'll just go to my object mode. I'll go to my blade right here, and I'll add a new texture inside of here. So I'll go to add image search. So I'll search for image texture, and I'll just drag this right here. And what I'll do, just so I can see this, is I'll plug this directly into emission, which is where we're going to be using it. So now what I'm going to do is just hit this little new icon right there. And what I'll do is call this rune emission, just like that. The width and height, 1024 is fine. If you got a slower computer, I would just leave it at that. For now, I'm going to jump it up to 4096, which is 4K. So it's just going to give us a little bit more resolution to work with. So it's going to be a little bit more detailed. And I'll just hit OK, just like that. And then immediately what we should do here is save this out. So currently this image is just in Blender's memory. If we save it out the disk, it won't actually remember how to do that. So go over here to our 2D view, and well, you'll notice that we don't actually see anything. So to kind of give you a tour of what this is over here, it's just going to display whatever texture that we want. So we can just choose what texture we want to see with this little pull down option right here. And what I'm going to choose right here is going to be our rune emission. And it's just going to be black. There's nothing near that because we haven't actually done anything yet. And I'll just go to this little pull down right here, go to image, we'll do save as. And I'll just go ahead and save this in our sword textures. I'll just call this rune emission PNG. I'll do save as image. And there we go. Now it's actually saved to disk. So it's not going to be in Blender anymore. So now what I'll do is I'll go over to my texture paint tab. And basically now we can actually start texturing this thing. And we got two different views. We have our 2D view over here. Then we have our 3D view over here. So we actually start texture painting just like this. I'm going to undo out of that. Or what we can do is actually texture paint over here. And you can see you can do it in either one. And they're both going to update. Just going to undo out of that. To give you a little bit more of a tour, we have things up here. So in this top menu right here, we have a bunch of brush settings. The hotkeys that we're going to want to get to know here are going to be open and close bracket just like that. So it's going to be make the radius of the brush bigger. We have strength up here, so this will just be how much of this color that we have right here, right there. I'm going to undo out of all that. We have a color, so we can change our color right here. We're going to leave this to white because we're actually going to colorize this in the node editor and then in the shader node editor. We can change our brush. We'll get into texture in a bit when we start to use our stencil. We have things like the fall off. So basically, if we want hard, if we want soft, so I'll show you what the hard brush looks like. So it's got a hard edge. So we're actually going to want to be using that. I'll undo out of all that. And then over here we have things like our draw brush. We have like soften, we have smear, clone stamp. So if you're coming from like Photoshop, these are all going to be very familiar for you. For now, we're just going to stick on draw. Cool. So now we actually want to bring in a stencil to use. So coming in here and actually painting these individual letters would be pretty tedious. So what we're going to do is bring in a stencil. So to make a stencil, what we're going to do is we're going to come down here to this little checkerboard properties. And this is going to be our brush properties. So this is getting into more of our properties here. And then what I'm going to do here is just click new. I'm going to go ahead and hit open. I'm going to navigate to our sword textures, and then I'm going to choose Rune Stencil, just like that. And then you'll see here that we actually get an icon right here, or this little texture that's kind of like overlaying on our viewport right here. You can actually see this in both the 2D view and the 3D view. And this is going to be a bit of a learning curve here because we're going to need to navigate our viewport like this and move around our stencil. So the hotkeys to be able to do this, or to be able to move this around, is on our mouse. We're going to choose a mouse right hold, and then we have things like shift right mouse to scale, and then we have control right mouse to move it around like that. What I'm going to do here is actually just leave this like this, and then what we can do is actually just start lining this up like that, and we can start painting on this like that. You can see that it's kind of, as we move around, you can kind of toggle. So that's if you ever like, I can't see what I'm doing, the good thing to do here is just start moving around like this, and you can actually just see through the stencil. But you can see right now that, you know, we can't really see anything, so we want to increase the strength of our brush. So before we actually start painting, what I'm going to do is just make our strength all the way up like this, and we'll do a value of 1 right there. And if you're having a difficult time with actually painting, like it's not actually showing up, you might actually not be on the right object. So what I'm going to do here is, you notice how we have this context menu right here. So currently we're in texture paint. So we've done object mode, we've done edit mode, and now we have a new one that's called texture paint. So if I go up to object mode, we can actually switch over here and then switch this over to texture paint, and we can start painting on that, and you can see our scratch mask comes up. That's not what we want to do, but we want to switch actually back to object mode and switch back over here, and then we'll just do texture paint right here. Great, and then what we can do here is just kind of go down like this and just continue to paint, and I can just use those hotkeys to navigate our stencil up and down like this. Just like that. Cool. So before I get much further, what I'll do is go up and set up the shader network so we can actually see the final result as we texture paint. Cool. So to set up this texture that we're painting on in the shader, what we'll do is we'll go back to our shader, and you can see that we've got it plugged into emission. So we're seeing something, but it doesn't look as cool as what we were seeing in the cinematic. So what I'm going to do here is on this Rune emission, what I'm going to do is drop in a color ramp, just like that. And I'll just drag and drop this over that noodle right there. And now you can see we have control over what this is going to be, so we can crunch it. It's not really doing much right now, but you can see if we select this white right here, and we come in here and start colorizing this, we can actually change the color. So what I'm going to do here is just give it this really saturated turquoise color. So I'll zoom in here so we can see what we're doing. So select that like that, select this, go right there. And then what we're going to do here is in our HSV, on our V, which is our luminance value, we're going to crank this up to something like 5. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go into our render settings and we're going to put a glow on it. So it's going to look closer to the cinematic. So what we'll do is we'll go to Eevee and then we'll go ahead and go to bloom. And now you can see that we actually are getting a bloom, a glow effect that's actually coming off of here. And we seem to have lost our colorize. So what I'm going to do here is just go back to my color here and just do a really saturated value like that. So these are my exact values right there. Cool. And now if I just navigate around like this, we can start to see, if I look at this more of a glancing angle like this, you can see that we're starting to get something that looks pretty good. And we can actually, right now, we can see the luminance value is actually only showing something like 4875, but if we go up to something like 50, it'll actually go brighter, even though it's not going to show those values. So I'm just going to set this to a value of 20. A value of 20, but I'm also going to make this really saturated like that. So it's a little tricky working with this stuff. It doesn't actually want us to go above that, but we're going to do it anyway. Great. So now what we'll do is we'll go back into our texture paint mode. And what we can do is instead of being in shaded mode, what we can do is just be in rendered mode. Just like that. So now we can actually texture paint on our final thing. And again, if you're working with a bit of a slower computer, I encourage you to kind of experiment with either look dev mode or texture paint mode, or maybe like toggle back and forth between the two. But just so you guys can get experience with this, I'm just going to show you this right there. So now we can just texture paint just like that and immediately get feedback on what that looks like. And to kind of continue filling this in, I'll just kind of continue to rotate between these. Just like that. And I'll just continue going down like this. And as I move closer, as I get more towards the end, you'll notice we'll need to scale it up. So I'm just going to do that. Shift and then right click. And then just line it up the best we can like that. Just like that. And I'm just going to go back into shaded mode so we can see what we're doing. So we can see we're kind of overlapping right there. That's okay. I'm not going to be too perfect for now. But just so we can see a little bit better, I'm going to switch to my texture mode. I'm going to scale this in just like that. Keep moving it like that. And this part will be a little bit repetitive. That's okay. And if you ever like accidentally like not paint anything like this, just make sure that your color is set to white like that. And we'll just continue moving this down. So continuously moving to scale. And we'll just keep going down like that. And as we go, we'll get smaller and smaller. Cool. So just a little bit more, and we'll be done with this. Cool, so I'll just do one more like that, and then we'll go back into our shaded mode. So we got this all textured painted, just like that. I'm going to go back to my shaded mode, just like that. And now we can see we got our textures. Cool, so just so you guys I want to show you guys what happens if we try to leave this file and go to a new one. So say if we try to just reopen up this shaded file like this. If I go to open, it's going to prompt us saying, hey, save one modified image. It's going to do that because we're trying to leave and we've texture painted on a textured and we haven't actually saved it to disk yet. So just make sure you're aware of that. I'll hit save and I'll just go ahead and reopen that final shaded file. And there we have that. Cool. So the final chapter is going to be just us repeating this process to do the Pommel. All right, so we'll finish this by doing our last texture. So while we're in object mode, what I'm gonna do is select this guy down here. But what I'm actually gonna do here is I'm gonna copy this ramp. So I'm gonna right click, copy that, or you can do Control C. I'm gonna come over here and then just paste that in there. just like that. And then I'm just going to plug this into emission. It's going to completely glow right now, which is not what we want, so we need to actually give it a texture. I'll just go to add image texture. So this part is going to be basically repeating what we did before. I'll go ahead and drop that. I'll plug this into factor right there. And I'll just go to new, and then same thing. We'll do a rune, but we'll do Pommel, just like that. And we'll do 4096, just like that. And I'll hit OK. So immediately we're going to want to save this to disk. So we'll go over here to our 2D view. We'll go to our drop down, and we'll do room Pommel. Then we'll go to the options right here, and we'll just do image save as. And I'll just save that as room Pommel. We'll do save image. And then we'll just go ahead and jump back to texture painting. Just like that. And then we'll just want to make sure that we see the right UVs over here. If we don't, you just go back to object mode, select that guy, and then go back into texture paint mode. Cool, so this will be the last texture that we do. If you ever are painting like this and you don't actually see anything, just make sure you switch this back over to white. Sometimes it'll accidentally get moved back over. Cool, so I'll go ahead and paint this down like that. And that'll be that. And then if I go over to shading, what we should see is that final rune glowing if we rotate around like that. Great, so that is wrapping it up. If I want to get rid of this stuff so I can actually see this stuff a little bit better, what I can do is toggle this off like that. Cool, so that's wrapping up for the texture painting. Cool, so last thing I want to do before we wrap this up is just show you guys how to play around with the HDRIs and get some different lighting. So if you come in this little pull down option right here, we notice we have this little dome right here. We can click on that and we can come in here and just kind of play with this. And this is just kind of a fun thing to do, just to kind of play around with presentation a bit. So feel free to come in here and just play around. I'm going to leave mine on the default one right there. And what I'm going to do is just bring down the background texture just like that. And this is going to be the final render that I leave off with. We can play around with the rotation like that. So I'm just going to leave it like something like that. Cool. So that wraps that up right there. All right, that's a wrap for Blender Fast Track Part 2. In Part 3, we'll be diving into the environment. We will talk about some environment layout techniques, and we will utilize this rock kit to build out the entire scene. We're going to chat about some lighting techniques and some cinematography techniques. Now, are you ready for Part 3? I'll see you next Thursday.